It's Thursday, the 20th of March, 2024. It's Uplift with Sion Marshall. Tonight, we have a very special guest with us who will discuss a number of issues that are relevant to the world, yes, specifically the UK, but also other parts of the world, and how it relates possibly to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We have a very special guest. So don't worry, the program starts right now. I read somewhere recently that this year, about 65% of the world's population would be engaged in general elections. That's significant. 65%. And then it dawned on me that democracies such as India, South Africa, and even the United Kingdom may all be possibly, well, definitely India and South Africa, and possibly the UK may be involved in elections this year. Now, you might be asking yourself, I mean, St. Vincent and the Grenadines or wherever you're watching, and that is irrelevant to me. Why is that even a topic of discussion? But especially for Vincentians, quite a large population of Vincentians reside in the UK, some with dual citizenship. They contribute to the UK economy and they contribute to the Vincentian economy. A number of our brothers and sisters, after retirement from the UK, return home to live. So that's significant. It means, therefore, that there may well be implications for how many of these elections go and what type of governments are elected. This evening, staying up late with us is someone who's familiar with the UK landscape and also quite recently has gotten familiar with the Vincentian landscape. He is a political activist and a former Labour advisor. Staying up late with us tonight is Mr. James Schneider. Let's welcome James to the program. James, good evening.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me. How are you doing?
I'm well. It's a pleasure to have you as well on the program, James. Back from the sunshine?
Yeah, I got back to London this week on Monday morning, and it's rained most of the time I've been here, and it's been very grey. And so, yeah, not quite the Vincentian weather I've grown accustomed to.
Well, so I'm not. I have no empathy for you whatsoever because I've had to deal with it. And while you're in St. Vincent and the Grenadines dealing with my sunshine, I had to be dealing with your greenness. So I'm quite happy that you're here to deal with some of this. So no empathy from me at all. No empathy. Uh, James, we met a few years ago, I think during COVID time, and I was quite well surprised that you had found yourself nestled in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Can you give me, before we get into who James really is, can you give me an idea as to how did you come to be in St. Vincent and the Grenadines? And apparently, you spent quite a lot of time there.
Yeah, well, it seems quite random, but I knew about the country from playing cricket with a Vincentian guy who would spend about half the year in the UK and about half the year in St. Vincent. So I knew a little bit about the country. And then in 2021, I heard that they were opening up direct flights. And it was in COVID time. And in the UK, we'd been to this horrible winter lockdown, stuck at home, can't leave the flat, the weather's terrible. And most of my work had become international. I work for the Progressive International, which is a global network of political parties, trade unions, social movements, and campaigns all over the world. So most people that I work with aren't here in London. I'm meeting them over Zoom. I'm talking to them like this, and also I was writing a book, and you don't really have to be anywhere to write a book. So I thought, well, let me escape the cold and COVID and more possible lockdowns, and see what St. Vincent is all about. So I really knew very little else other than that. I got myself a ticket, and over I came in October 2021, and I completely fell in love with with the country. Absolutely fell in love with the country. It's the most wonderful place that I've had the privilege of spending time, and I've had the privilege of traveling and working in other countries. I've probably traveled and worked in over 50 countries, and St Vincent is the one that has grabbed my heart the most. Beautiful country.
Now I'm going to cut this out and send this to the Ministry of Tourism and the Tourism Authority, and hopefully that will be a fantastic advertisement for the Tourism Authority. Now we'll get back to that because I want to tie it up a bit, but let's talk about James Schneider, the person, currently a political activist. After meeting you in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we chatted for a while and so forth. We kept in touch. But I'm scrolling through TikTok, which is where everybody gets their news now, and I'm seeing clips of it, and I'm like, this is the same guy I was talking to recently. Realize that you're quite a pundit. So give us a little bit of the background of James, the political activist, and also your journey within the UK Labour Party.
So after I left university about 15 years ago, I became a journalist focused on Africa. And so for about 5 years after that, 5 or 6 years after that, I was living in London, but I was getting to travel a lot. I was reporting from different parts of the continent. I was editing a lot. I was learning a lot. It was a really great and interesting time. And I really wasn't involved in British politics really in any way. And I found myself getting involved in British politics from sort of 2015 onwards, in part by accident, and in part because of my in fact, yes, directly connected to my journalistic work, although in slightly surprising ways. So first, I had covered the Nigerian elections, which happened in April 2015. And although it wasn't a perfect democratic process, far from it, although it was probably the best election that has been held in the country since the return to democracy at the back end of the last millennium. But there was certainly a spirit in the country that a big decision was taking place. People were talking about politics in the street, and it was the election was present. You could feel that people were involved in it. And then the next month, Britain had a general election. And I remember going to vote in the morning on my way to work, and it could have been any other day. There was no real discussion. There's no feeling that, as a people coming together, collectively taking a decision about our future. And I found that really struck me. I found that very sort of emotionally destabilizing. So I decided to get involved in British politics then, and I joined the Labour Party, who had just lost that election in 2015. And it seemed like they were going on a journey in the political direction away from mine. I have, I would say, socialist, ecological, and anti-imperialist politics. That's my sort of basic understanding of the world. And Labour were going to go in the other direction. But Labour is one of the two main parties in Britain that, generally speaking, can take power. The only two that have been in power in the last 100 years. Other than the Lib Dems, they were the junior partner in coalition, but that doesn't count. So I sort of wanted to get involved, didn't really know how to. And then there was a leadership election within the Labour Party, and there were 4 candidates, and 3 of them seemed to come from that same previous mold of kind of elite, technocratic, not very pro-people politics that had come to summarize the new Labour government under Tony Blair. And then there was this random guy called Jeremy Corbin, who was a 200-to-1 outsider, who was the only one I'd had any contact with before, because he was one of the only British politicians who was interested in the Central African Republic. And I was doing some reporting on the civil war in the Central African Republic, and he was doing some interfaith work between Muslim and Christian communities. So, I met him a couple of times, and knew that he was, from that, a kind of decent person who wants to do the right sorts of things. And I just come back from a reporting trip on Boko Haram, which is an Islamist sort of terrorist group in northeast Nigeria, northern Cameroon, bit in Chad. And so I had a little bit of time off work after that reporting trip. maybe 2 weeks. So I went to go and volunteer on this leadership election campaign for Jeremy Corbin. Think it was going nowhere. He was an outsider, but it was something to do, and I needed to scratch this itch I had. Anyway, turns out he became wildly popular within the Labour Party, and he won that leadership election in a landslide. And I basically never went back to work. And I ended up forming an organisation, political organisation called Momentum, which ended up swelling to 40,000 members, which supported Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. And then I moved over and became his press secretary. I had a slightly different title. I was spokesperson and director of strategic communications, but in effect, his press secretary. And so I did that while he was leader of the party through till 2020. So that's my political backstory in the Labour Party. These clips you've been seeing on TikTok, that's I do a bit of talking in the media, analysis, commentary, punditry, etc. And I did that at the beginning of when we set up Momentum, because there weren't very many people with, let's say, left-wing, socialist, progressive politics in Britain who had very much experience of the media. And I had some experience of the media, but as a journalist in a different guise.
Yes. Yes.
But I had been on all of the major broadcasters before, but more as a reporter or as a kind of expert rather than as a competent, as a where they're trying to get you rather than hear from you. So I have some experience of doing that, and I've been doing that off and on. But I think the ones you've been seeing on TikTok have been after the war on Gaza, after the 7th.
Primarily, yes. Where one individual referred to as a tin pot, but we'll get to that one.
Yes, he got very angry.
He was mad. He was livid. So we get to that as well. But so you've had all of this experience in the UK. You understand policy. You moved to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The similarities between the UK and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, some may not recognize, but we are both islands. Mm-hmm. Now you're on St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We are a developing country, but classified as a middle-income country. As you traverse the country, and I know you play football with the guys and so on, what's your impression of how things are and how resilient we are in relation to exogenous shocks?
So I suppose it depends what those shocks would be. I mean, there are some underlying great strengths that I think St. Vincent, its geography and society provides, and I think often those are underappreciated inside the country. I think quite often people don't know how good some of these things are. So I think the abundant fresh water supply from the rivers, the quality of the soil, the amount of food that can be grown with relatively low levels of mechanization and relatively low levels of fertilizer, and the social fabric I think is very strong in the country. I think that's extremely important and very clear. And I think those things make the country fundamentally very resilient. But that said, of course, there are some clear things where shocks would hurt a lot. I mean, St. Vincent, it imports a very large amount of the things that are consumed on the island. And as an outsider, you notice it straight away. Everything which is produced on the island is affordable, and everything that is imported near enough is quite expensive. And so clearly those sorts of shocks to supply chains can have a big impact. Obviously, we've seen quite a lot of inflation over the last couple of years globally, and St. Vincent hasn't been immune to that. But I think it's been somewhat insulated relative to other middle-income countries because the currency is effectively pegged to the dollar. And so other countries who have been having economic difficulties because of global economic difficulties have also had currency problems, which then amplifies the inflation issue. So St. Vincent, I think, because of its currency, has been insulated from that somewhat.
Okay, absolutely. Now, you referenced the idea that because of the level of importation that we engage in, we cannot be insulated from a number of these shocks. And over the last 4 years, we've had COVID, we've had the conflict in Ukraine, and we've had the conflict in the Middle East, in Gaza, something that you've been very vocal about. But outside of that, do you think that the stability or lack of stability of a country like the UK, for example, has contributed to that? You said, James, that you covered elections in Africa. If Nigeria had 5 prime ministers in 6 years, the UK tabloids would not stop talking about how rubbish the democracy is. But the UK did. How has that affected domestic situations, being also a significant player in the Eurozone that you've now left, and also a place where there's a lot of immigration, including from St. Vincent and the Grenadines? How has that instability affected things globally, you think?
So I think, for St. Vincent, instability in anything that it's got the strongest connections to is going to have clear impact, and it's hard to be insulated from that. So, if things happen in Canada, the US, or the UK, which affect living standards in those countries, that's going to make it harder for Vincentians living there to send money back, to save money, to then come back and build a home, to support family, to start businesses that does trade between those countries and St. Vincent, to bring, one of the great things I've seen, just as a tangent, from some of the returning Vincentians coming from other countries, is the desire to put St. Vincent on the map and set up some sort of export business or something that can both show off St. Vincent to the world and bring some hard currency into the country. And of course, the economic situation in Britain is bad and has been for quite a long time. Pay in real terms is below where it was in 2005. The living standards have fallen for the majority in Britain over the last 15 years or so, and that will have knock-on effects. The changing prime ministers and the political turmoil, I think, is a result of that underlying economic and social issues that Britain's rulers can't really work out how to run the country. But you're quite right. I mean, there's a really good, very funny Twitter account by a guy called Gatara, Gathara. He's been running this long-standing series of if global North countries, if basically the US, the UK, the EU, were reported on in the same way that Western media reported on African countries. And the thread on Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman and Boris Johnson and all of these figures of mayhem in British politics has all been very funny. So no, you're quite right that if the gaze were reversed, it would make for quite interesting reading.
Quite interesting. So let's come home because we've started that. And the UK has been under Tory leadership, the Conservatives, since 2010 or thereabout. I remember that election where Cameron won and had to do a coalition with the Lib Dems then, and they've been in charge since then. But one of the challenges I've recognized, James, is that there has been a rise in prejudicial rhetoric over that period. Anti-immigration rhetoric, and especially within the last 2 to 3 years, when your Home Secretary have been of immigrant descent, and even your Prime Minister, there has been this serious rise in anti-immigration rhetoric. And my question is, what where did that start? Why do you think that was necessary in British politics? I mean, you have a history of colonialism, yes, and I thought that you were getting beyond that. But during the Tories' tenure, I find that there has been that really increase in prejudicial language. Where do you think that came from, and how do you see that? How do you see the UK getting past that?
So I think that when they are not able to make life better for the majority of people, or at least make life better for a large minority of people, and then another large minority of people think that their lives could get better soon, then they start having to maintain power by dividing people. And that's where you get the racist rhetoric, the anti-migrant sentiment, the anti-refugee rhetoric. So I think that's its fundamental root. You are right that it has happened in recent years it's with an interesting twist in that the recent Conservative governments at their very top, or recent administrations, I should say, at their very top, have been the most diverse in British history. We've had non-white foreign secretary, home secretary, prime minister, chancellor. Those are the four biggest jobs in the country, and all in recent years there have been one or more non-white minority holders of those offices. But that has been coupled, generally speaking, with a more aggressively xenophobic, more aggressively anti-migrant, more kicking down rather than punching up type of politics. That's not because they are of a minority. That's not because it's not because the Home Secretary is of one background that those are the policies, but it's an interesting thing that has happened. It's in part because David Cameron, who was the Conservative leader who won in 2010 and became Prime Minister in 2010 and was Prime Minister from 2010 to 2016, he's now back as Foreign Secretary. He had a policy to change the face of his party when he was in opposition, and he fast-tracked a lot of candidates, including a lot of talented, I would say, morally wrong and with the wrong politics and so on, but talented in terms of media performance, skills, etc., into the party, and especially those from minority backgrounds. So that's why there's this crop at the top of the party who you get this thing that on first sight looks peculiar, where the party that seems the most anti-migrant with the most aggressive rhetoric is one where all of its leaders are in some way of migrant background.
Absolutely, and I find that to be quite interesting. You've been, and I have a video that I would show you. You've been critical of Keir Starmer. This video has to do with some criticism that you've leveled against him, including you were speaking generally or specifically regarding the current situation in the Middle East, but you broadened it a bit and talked about lack of leadership. But how does a Labour government change that, though? How does elections are expected? Just this morning, he was on radio demanding essentially that the Prime Minister call the elections because Britain needs change. But essentially, what would be the difference for immigrants, for individuals from the Caribbean who are in the UK, who are looking to come to the UK under Labour government? Just last year, I remember that there were plans to introduce an electronic travel document. I can't remember what it's called, ETD or something like that, before coming to the UK. How is Labour going to improve that situation for immigrants?
So I would say that in this area, like in almost all areas of policy, Labour aren't going to make things better but they will likely make things worse at a slower rate. Now, that doesn't sound very inspiring, because it isn't very inspiring. It does mean that it will be, it's a win. It is much better to get rid of this Conservative government, which is, objectively the worst government the country has ever had since we've been having elections. I mean, they've been in power for 14 years. Most people in the country are worse off. But every single public service is worse. The infrastructure is worse. The people's living standards are down. Things are expensive. Life expectancy stopped rising. Mental health is very poor. There are a whole series of reasons why this Conservative government should be, shown the door very swiftly. But Labour's approach since Keir Starmer became the leader has been to say that they won't change very much. And the idea there that they have is that if the Tories, if they make the bullseye quite small, the target quite small, the difference between them quite small, then the Tories will get voted out because they're very bad and people vote against governments, and then Labour will get voted in. But they're not going to be voted in because people are excited about what they are saying they will do, because what they're saying they will do is not very much. So let's take rhetoric around immigration, for example. So Rishi Sunak and first Suella Braverman, when she was Home Secretary, and it continues now, James Cleverly is Home Secretary, they made a moral panic over refugees crossing the Channel into centrepiece. Now it's very interesting where this moral panic came from and how it was stimulated, because it began in 2020, in the summer of 2020, exactly after the Black Lives Matter protests, after the killing of George Floyd came about. And of course, we all know in the US that those were the biggest wave of protests in US American history. But in the UK, they were also very large and had huge amounts of support. When the Premier League season started again without stadiums during COVID, all the players had Black Lives Matter on their backs. It was an extremely had a huge amount of public support, and there was all this polling about how the public had moved decisively in an anti-racist direction. And on all sorts of, long-standing polling questions, they've been asking people, how would you feel if your child came home with somebody of another ethnic or racial background? Those sorts of things all showed that the country had changed a lot and in a progressive direction. And it was exactly at this time that then Home Secretary, who's Priti Patel, then started talking up the problem of small boats crossing the Channel. Now, refugees have crossed the Channel forever. The mechanism changes depending on what the checks are. So the issue used to be people in the backs of lorries, and there were some tragic cases of people of some suffocations and so on in them. But that used to be the main route in. That got closed down. So then the boats became a larger route in. But Priti Patel, I think, whether consciously or unconsciously, I think consciously, in response to this anti-racist sentiment that was sweeping the nation in response to Black Lives Matter protest, decided to switch tack and demonize this threat of the other here being people fleeing, the largest group being those from Afghanistan, fleeing to Britain, making a very dangerous journey on these small boats. And she did that with lots of media spectacle. She created a new force with they gave a good-looking man a new uniform to go and stand there and say, we're going to stop these boats. And they flew RAF planes over the top of these boats as if that had any impact at all, other than to make good pictures for television. And then they offered all of the broadcast media to be embedded on these patrol ships when they went and picked up and tried to deal with these refugees coming across in boats. And that's basically been consistent since then. It's in order to shift attention to something which in numerical terms is pretty small. I mean, in relative numerical terms, in absolute relative terms, it's quite big. We've had 4,000 people have crossed the channel in the first 3 months of this year, which is quite a lot of people in absolute terms. That's 4,000 people, all with stories, the vast majority of whom will be genuine refugees who need and deserve love and support and help. But turning that into a big, a supposed big crisis, so that the media and the political class, rather than talk about why pay is low, why our National Health Service is on its knees with the lowest satisfaction levels ever recorded, why there was a new report out this week that shows that Britain has the most expensive, lowest quality and smallest housing stock of comparable countries, and so on and so forth, rather than dealing with these very large issues, which are actually the things that most people in Britain most care about. When you poll people in Britain, those are the issues that they care about. They try to talk up this issue instead. And the point is never to fix it. They don't want to make the issue solved so that they can move on to deal with these other issues, people's energy bills, the fact that we have sewage in our water system because of our terrible privatized water system. The idea is to always have it available in the headlines.
How then, what do you see, James, as the silver lining? Because you do not, you see a slowing down, but ultimately the same trajectory with the Labour government. The Tories, as you said, things are extremely expensive in the UK. I remember recently there was a change in, and you may be able to explain it better. Brits who marry overseas, in order to bring their spouse here, they have to be making, I think, $38,000 a year. But a junior doctor in the UK makes $30,000 a year. So even a junior doctor, couldn't bring his spouse. So things have gotten are being made even more difficult. Just recently, the Chancellor made a big package, rather budget package, that apparently Labour supported. But most individuals listening to, commentators, I spend a lot of time listening to LBC. A friend of mine who's been here for a very long time introduced me to LBC, so I listened to O'Brien, I think his name is. But most of them seem to disagree with the impact of that measure by the Chancellor. However, Starmer seemed to have supported it essentially. But what's the silver lining? Where does Britain go even under Labour government?
So the silver lining doesn't come yet, I don't think. I think the silver lining, it's not the thing that gives me hope, I'll put it that way, is that things are getting worse, but people are not just sitting back and taking it. I mean, we've recently had a wave of strike actions from, you mentioned doctors. The junior doctors have been on strike because they are, their conditions are very bad. You'd expect doctors to have reasonable pay and conditions and so on, and yes, at the top that is the case, but for a very large number of them it isn't. Pay for nurses has fallen in real terms something like £6,500 a year since 2010. I mean, these are huge belt tightenings that most people have had to put up with, and there were strikes, people won higher pay. And we're seeing this on lots of issues. When energy bills were doubling and then doubling and then doubling again, there this almost spontaneous movement called Don't Pay took up, saying that they were going to not pay energy bills. And part of that pressure caused the then Liz Truss Tory administration to put forward a package to reduce energy bills. So there are all of these rumblings under the surface that aren't getting political expression in, I think, right across British society. And I think that the new Labour government will get a small honeymoon period, but it won't be very long, because yes, there are lots of people who, you know, you just think implicitly, you know, Labour must do something. You know, they must really want to do something. They're just saying they're not going to do something, do anything because you know, they think that's smart or something. And really, it has to get better. How can it not get better if we can't get, you know, once this terrible government is out? And I think 6 months, 12 months into the Labour government, we'll suddenly see very large challenges against the government on behalf, you know, in a much more popular way on behalf of the majority of people in the country. And I think that is a potentially very exciting opening for quite major change in Britain. Now, that's speculative, but I think that's it's better to look ahead with clear eyes about what's going to come, and then plan for that and try to turn that in a better direction, rather than just sit back and hope that, despite all of the available evidence, that the incoming Labour government is going to be the kind of reforming government that Britain has occasionally had in difficult periods. I mean, at the beginning, when Keir Starmer initially took over as leader, there was some hope that he would be a figure more like Clement Attlee, who was the British Prime Minister in 1945, who was personally part of the establishment, like Keir Starmer is, who was personally not radical. Keir Starmer is personally not radical, but because what the situation demanded in post-war Britain to rebuild the country, and because of the strength of the trade unions, the social movements in the country, and the basic demands of people returning from war for healthcare and for housing, that it ended up being, and it's, you know, the most reforming, most progressive government that we've had in the country, that created the National Health Service, that nationalised lots of industries and the Bank of England, that built huge numbers of housing, and so on and so forth, built the social safety net that was enjoyed for a long time in Britain. But that's not going to be the case. That isn't the kind of politics that they're putting forward. And also, I mean, things getting bad for a bit at a slower pace is still a lot better than things getting bad at a worse pace. I mean, if we go back to the issue of migration and making people's lives difficult, let's not forget the record of this government. In 2010, when they came in, they created a unit in number 10 Downing Street in the Prime Minister's office. That was the Make Lives More Difficult for Migrants unit. Make the paperwork harder to fill in, change the forms every year and the criteria every year so it's more difficult, increase the fees, and so on and so forth. You know, an active policy to make life more difficult for sections of the population. And this culminated in the deportation of British citizens.
Oh, wow.
The deportation of British citizens of Caribbean descent, primarily of Caribbean descent, British citizens, people who had been in Britain all of their lives, had come as children from the English-speaking Caribbean, who had been deported.
Yeah. I remember the whole issue over the Windrush situation. I believe it was called.
Yes, that's what. Yeah, the Windrush scandal. It was called. And I mean, really, and this again, you know, I think shows how, at least in politics and the media, you know, race still structures it somewhat. I mean, a government deporting its own citizens because it can't tell if they're their citizens. I mean, that is the sort of thing that you would imagine in any country that government would fall and those people would never be seen or heard from again. I mean, you know, deporting grandmothers who have lived in Britain for 60 years.
Yeah, that was
is so utterly shameful that it's hard to even imagine. Imagine that your grandmother gets deported one day, turned up, oh, you haven't filled in the forms correctly, oh, we don't actually have you down as a British citizen, okay, you're out. It's unspeakable.
Mm. Now, I wanted to shift gears a little bit, but before we do so, I want to play that clip where you're commenting on Stam, and I'll give you a few seconds to comment on the comments that you're making, and then we'll switch a little bit and speak about your activism in Gaza.
It is, very simple. I mean, Starmer has many hats to wear on this one, and you couldn't have trusted the predecessor with any of them.
So I really don't think we should be talking about this issue, which is to do with the lives and deaths of thousands of people through the prism of Labour Party internal politics, which most people in this country don't know about, and certainly the people that are losing their lives in West Asia know absolutely nothing about. The reason why Keir Starmer is under pressure is because he has tucked in behind the government, who themselves are then tucked in behind the US in their support for Israeli war crimes. That's why he's under pressure. And it's not because of Muslims or these voters or that voters. 76% of people in this country want to see a ceasefire now. And that's because that's the common sense position, because most people know that you don't respond to the unjustifiable killing of one group of children by killing a whole load more children. It doesn't make any sense. So what we should be doing, what we need from our politicians, which we don't have because they're in lockstep in support of the Israeli bombing campaign at the moment, is to call for a ceasefire, because Britain not only provides diplomatic support for Israel, but we also help arm Israel. So we are complicit in the crimes which are taking place, and therefore we have an outsized role in the ability to try to bring about peace.
But this sorry to interject, James, but this is about Labour's response, potentially our future Prime Minister's position on this.
Right, and what I'm saying is he's not doing his job, because 76% of people, according to a YouGov poll, want a ceasefire now. That is not a position that is being put forward by either of the two major parties, which are parroting the same line and are just following the US. The US changes position slightly, they change position slightly. What I think we actually want from our next Prime Minister, from our politicians, is leadership, not following, and to stand up and say, the overwhelming majority of the British public, 76% of the public, according to polling, is in support of the common sense position, which is to preserve the maximum amount of life. And therefore, we should be putting pressure on Israel to show maximum restraint and to stop razing Gaza to rubble, to turn back on the food, the water, the electricity and the fuel, so that some relief can get in. We're just hearing on your show just now that the UN, who have already had 35, more than 35 probably now, of its own aid workers killed in bombing in Gaza, run out of fuel, unable to perform any services. This is an incredibly intense humanitarian catastrophe, and that's why the people of this country want to see a ceasefire, and that's why Keir Starmer is failing in his duty as leader of the opposition to not call for it.
Okay, but
strong comments, James. You says he's failing, he's not doing his job, but he's potentially Britain's next Prime Minister.
I mean, I think there is an almost dead certainty he's Britain's next Prime Minister, but that's not because he's channeling the public will. I mean, if you take that, the poll I was citing there, he wasn't in that position then where 96% of the British public were. As an aside, it was 8% who opposed a ceasefire in that poll. The rest were don't know. And what I said about leading and following is quite right. He now says that he wants to see a humanitarian ceasefire, but since that interview and today, tens of thousands of people have died. Since that interview and today, more children have died in that conflict, in that tiny strip of land, than had died in all the conflicts in the last 5 years on all of Earth. When we talk about failure, when we talk about lack of leadership, that's what we're talking about. Leadership is one of two things. It is either having a vision and seeing where a country needs to go, where a people need to be, and leading that charge. Or it is being a voice for the people, where you hear what the people are saying and you speak on their behalf because you have the capacity or the power to do so. And he does neither, which is why he will be Prime Minister, but he will never be a leader for the British people as a whole. He will be their Prime Minister, he will be in office, he won't be in power.
So do you? I don't want you to speculate too much, James. But if this is the situation, do you see within the ranks of Labour anyone who can possibly challenge him in the same way that after Cameron left, you had what's her name? I can't remember her name now. You tell me.
Theresa May.
Yes, and then she was challenged by Johnson, and then Johnson was challenged by the 2 month prime minister, and then she was challenged by somebody else. Do you see anybody in the ranks of Labour who can put that kind of pressure on Starmer following his election?
I mean, history is moving very fast. Like if you looked at that 2015 election, the one where I suddenly felt this gut kick 9 years ago, and David Cameron had just been re-elected. He'd been proven right, supposedly. The establishment was in charge. If you'd said to them then that in a year's time he'll be out, that in another 4 years' time there would be another 4 prime ministers, the chaos that we've seen, no one would have predicted that.
You'd have laughed.
It would have laughed. It would have said it's ridiculous. I mean, David Cameron's election slogan in 2015 was chaos with Ed Miliband or stability with David Cameron. I mean, we've had nothing but chaos since then. So I think it's very hard to predict exactly what are the things that can happen. But you can see the broader picture. And the broader picture is that the Starmer's Labour government will come in for a serious challenge from the hard right, because that's more where the Conservatives are going, and they will present themselves as being the voice of the people. And then we hope from democratic forces. And some of those might be in the Labour Party, some of those might be outside the Labour Party, some of them might be in movements, some of them might just be in communities of ordinary people. But we will see those things, and out of that, openings will happen. And that's, for me, that's where the hope is.
So that clip also spoke to the issue in Gaza and your own concern about what is happening there. What is the driving force, James, behind your own passion and your involvement in mobilizing people to speak out against this conflict?
I think it's just a very clear injustice. I myself am Jewish, but I have never been particularly focused in my politics and activism on that conflict. On my logic had always been that lots of other people are focused on that issue, and there are many other things for me to be focused on. And I'm happy I made that decision. There are whole other parts of the world that I know reasonably well because of that decision. But I think that the scale of the horror that we're seeing in this conflict is so stark, and the role of Britain and the US is so clear and so wrong that it would just be entirely wrong to not speak up against it and to organize against it. So I'm very proud that I'm involved in various organizing efforts with the Progressive International and others in trying to disrupt the war machine. I mean, the level of killing, dispossession, destruction that we are seeing is just it's just so extreme. It's just so extreme that it merits, I think, a response from the whole of humanity. And actually, really, that is, in the whole, what you are seeing. I mean, almost every country in the world has come out against the Israeli crimes. It's only a small handful of countries that are the US's closest allies and subordinates that have said that they stand behind Israel and Israel can do what it likes. It's just that those are the most powerful countries, or have been historically the most powerful countries.
But you make a very important point, James, if I may. it's not even so much those countries, but rather the leaders of those countries. Because
Correct.
if you've got the US, if you've got the UK, even in Germany, the populations themselves are not in favor of what is happening, but the leaders, for some reason, seem to be in lockstep with Israel. As a matter of fact, I think you refer to that and the media houses as carrying water for the Israeli regime. On the 27th, the rapporteur of the UN on Gaza gave a press conference. And these are some more comments, James. You used words in your discussion. You said it was extreme and so on and so forth. But this is how the rapporteur characterized what is happening in Gaza. And we'll talk a little bit about this.
Months of unrelenting Israeli assault on occupied Gaza, it is my solemn duty to report on the worst of what humanity is capable of and to present my finding: the anatomy of a genocide. One of my key findings is that Israel's executive and military leadership and soldiers have intentionally distorted rules of international humanitarian law, distinction, proportionality, and precaution in an attempt to legitimize genocidal violence against the Palestinian people by deliberately stretching the definitions of human shield, evacuation orders, warnings, safe zones, collateral damage, and medical protection. Israel has used their protective function as humanitarian camouflage, with the effect of concealing patterns of conduct from which the only inference can reasonably be drawn is a state policy of genocidal violence against the Palestinians. In light of this, I find that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the threshold indicating the commission of the crime of genocide against Palestinians as a group in Gaza has been met. Specifically, Israel has committed 3 acts of genocide with the requisite intent: causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group.
The rapporteur is saying Israel is committing genocide, and she's clearly outlined the 3 areas where she believes that this is the case. Now, I saw a bit of the press conference where one reporter, and it was one of the strangest questions, and I use the word strange, where he was asking, is there any documents from the government that shows that intent? And you can see the frustration on her face when she responded. She couldn't wait, and she said, if you go to Bosnia-Herzegovina or Rwanda, did you find any documents from the government like this? And I even go back to your labor leader, who, as a human rights lawyer, was quick to speak about war crimes committed by Putin in Ukraine, but wasn't sure what was happening in Israel. I mean, where is this double standard coming from? And with the UN having gotten to a point where it is agreed, okay, there's genocide, what needs to happen now?
So I'll come to what needs to happen now in a minute. I just want to respond to a couple of other points there. The reason why leaders in the West respond differently, hypocritically, to issues is because of the gradient of power. You know, if the gradient of power runs one way, they can see things, and if it runs the other way, they cannot. So you end up with the grotesque spectacle of a celebrated human rights lawyer being asked if cutting off food, fuel, water, and medicine was a right that Israel had, and says, yes, Israel has that right, when that is a clear war crime, and it is a war crime which has led to the famine that we are now seeing, which is contributing, as we've just heard from Special Rapporteur Albanese, to what prima facie seems like a genocide. Now, on the point of documents, there are actually some documents, but let's leave those aside. Let's listen to what the Israeli high officials said. That's all you need to do, because they have done what they have said they will do. On the 8th of October, the Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, he said that he has ordered a total siege of Gaza, shutting off all food, fuel, water, and electricity. He said that we are dealing with human animals and we will respond accordingly. The president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, on the 16th of October, he said there are no innocent people. He said that it's an entire nation out there that's responsible. We have seen these things again and again. We have seen Netanyahu say that we have to control the entire area from the river to the sea. We've seen National Security Minister Ben-Gvir say that Gaza will have to be occupied and settled afterwards, and there will have to be more ethnic cleansing. We've heard again and again and again throughout the Israeli government, at the very top, you don't even need to look at their outriders, their junior ministers, their MPs who sit on their backbenches who have said the most atrocious things. Just pick the top 4, 5, 6 officials, and it is all there. And I think that's part of what I find so shocking about the elite response in the north, in the west, to this conflict, because ordinary people in Britain can see it. Most people in Britain think that this war is wrong and is horrific. But there was an interesting piece of polling that came out in the US. The US staunch supporter of Israel. If Israel turned off the weaponry, the war would end tomorrow, give or take. Just a day or two before the interim ruling came out from the International Court of Justice, the world's highest court, in South Africa's genocide case against Israel. So before that ruling, where the world's highest court said that, yes, it's plausible Israel is committing genocide and that they will pursue that case, that 35% of the US public thought that Israel was committing genocide and 36% didn't. The rest don't know. Now, one imagines that number is higher now. So Joe Biden can't see it, and Donald Trump can't see it, and all of the well-paid analysts on CNN and so on, they can't see it, but ordinary people can see it, because you have to be paid a lot of money to pretend to be that stupid.
Now, we have to wrap up because we're running out of time, but I remember sending the first video to you, James, and you said you're not on TikTok.
No.
But TikTok seems to be the way to go. Are you... TikTok has had a bigger influence on this conflict, including your marches, than all of mainstream media, I think. Look, I'm in the UK, James, and if I want to watch news, I have to pay to watch BBC. I have to pay to subscribe to watch any of the channels. But you know what I can get free? I can get Al Jazeera free on my laptop, and I can get TikTok. But there seems to be this attitude of policing the free media. You see what's happening in the US with the Congress and TikTok. How do you share any concern, James, about that trajectory that government seems to be moving towards, where they're trying to muzzle the voice of the ordinary man, the masses, through not just the overregulation, but almost the seizing of social media, which is where they have their voice?
Yes, absolutely. And you see this actually throughout history, that when a kind of ruling class, a social system is feeling self-confident, it allows criticism and it allows new channels for that criticism. And when it is feeling insecure and threatened, which is what our rulers feel like, because no one likes them and the system is not going well. I mean, there was a recent poll, it's actually from the Office of National Statistics in the UK for last year. 12% of people in Britain trust political parties. 12. Nearly 90% of people don't trust political
Wow.
parties in a parliamentary representative system. They've lost control. So I don't think it is surprising, and I think it is to be resisted. Now, that doesn't mean that every aspect of social media is good. Far from it. I have a lot of criticisms about how different companies themselves engage in censorship, have proximity to the state, how their algorithms are used and developed, and the impact it has on children. But it is clear from all of the evidence that those who have greater access to the information of what is really going on have different views from those that don't have the access to the information. And that's why they're trying to shut. I mean, this moral panic in the US establishment that, you know, China has subverted young Americans' minds through TikTok by making them support Palestine. It's like, or Nancy Pelosi saying that, you know, the protesters are there because of China. We had the same thing here, where they said it was Iran that had organized these the pro-Palestinian protests. You know, hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of London. You know, the Iranian regime just clicks its fingers, and they can't see. You know, there's some wiring that has gone missing in the establishment brain that can't see what is in front of it, which is the majority of people are horrified in them, and they are horrified by what they are seeing in the system. So they are looking for alternatives. Now, some of those alternatives might be bad. Some of them might be good. But the fact that people are looking for alternatives and they are finding it in different places is itself a good thing. So I think all of this attempts at censorship and so on and so forth. And also it's the same, you see it again with this, the rhetoric about fake news and disinformation. I mean, you'll know, as a fellow former press secretary, I mean, I know how the sausage is made. I know how fake news is created because I saw it done to us many times a day, every day for 4 or 5 years. Now, the idea that the paper of record, the Times of London or the New York Times, they don't engage in fake news, disinformation and state-directed action is preposterous. I mean, there is a huge record of it. So fake news is everywhere, and just because it is on the front page of a newspaper or on CNN or whatever, that itself doesn't make it true. So in that context, having the widest possible access to different types of information is so important, because nothing is pure.
One of the biggest ironies, and I said this in closing, one of the biggest ironies of the TikTok story in the US is Jeff Jackson, the congressman who built his career on TikTok with 2.5 million followers and then voted to ban it, and went on TikTok to explain exactly why he did, and that, oh, I know more than you and I see things that you don't see, so that is why I went to ban it. That was just hilarious. And many of his followers just started unfollowing him. He lost over 200,000 plus followers in a couple of hours. So that I found to be quite ironic. James, we are out of time. I know you have something to do as well. So let me thank you so much for staying up late with me, and commit to doing this again as one former press secretary to the other.
Yes, of course. I'd love to. I've really enjoyed it. Happy to come on whenever.
All right. Thank you so much, James. All the best. Take care.
Right. Thanks a lot. Bye.
All right. So that was James Schneider staying up with us this evening. I hope you enjoyed that discussion. I thoroughly did. Now, in closing, something happened a few days ago in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Actually, it happened yesterday. The soft opening of Sandals Resort, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as they welcomed their first guest. And it looks to me like since I left St. Vincent and the Grenadines, everything is happening and I'm missing out on everything. But I followed it with pride and with excitement. And I tell you something, what Sandals can do for the marketing of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I wouldn't say we couldn't do for ourselves, but what I would say is what it would cost us if we had to pay for that would be significant and exorbitant. So we appreciate the Sandals brand and what they can do. And so seeing this yesterday was one of the most fantastic things. I went on the account of Adam Stewart and I stole it so I can show it for those who haven't seen it. I tell you, I am impressed and I'm happy. And I congratulate St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and I congratulate the Sandals brand for opening up their 9th and, according to Adam, the most beautiful resort in the region. Until tomorrow, Lord, until next week, when I'm back with you with another edition of Uplift with Sion Marshall, I'm saying good night.
Welcome to Sandals, St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Welcome to Sandals, St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Welcome to Sandals St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Today we welcome our first guests and open this incredible resort with people from all across the world. This resort will feature more innovations, more sandals firsts than any resort we've built in the history of the company. Just take a look behind me at the 300-foot linear pool, the first of its kind for the brand. This resort has been developed in this incredible nature valley, nestled on a private cove. We cannot wait to welcome each and every one of you to the all-new Sandals St. Vincent and the Grenadines.